While the US-China Geneva talks reached a consensus on tariffs and trade, allowing American companies to resume ordering from China and avoiding empty shelves in the US, America's problems remain fundamentally unsolved. In fact, its crisis is worsening. On May 15th, global sovereign credit rating agency Moody's announced a major downgrade of the US credit rating from its highest AA to AAE, marking the first major setback for the US in international institutions since Trump launched his global trade war. Unlike ordinary credit ratings, the US sovereign credit rating is uniquely critical. It affects foreign investors' confidence in the US market, the credibility of Treasury bonds, the core asset of the US financial system, and the US dollar, the world's primary settlement currency for international trade. A downgrade signals concerns that the US government may struggle to repay its debts, prompting investors to hedge risks and institutions to protect their own credibility. With all three major global credit rating agencies, Fitch, S&P, and now Moody's, having downgraded the US, the decline in American national credit is an undeniable reality, bound to severely disrupt the US financial system. This crisis stems from multiple factors. Persistent fiscal deficits have driven US government debt to exceed $36 trillion over the past decade, while Trump's global tariff wars have introduced unprecedented uncertainty. Since April, surging Treasury yields have eroded the US capacity to service its debt. Moody's projects that by 2035, US federal interest payments will account for 30% of fiscal revenue, with the tariff policies potentially triggering a debt crisis ahead of schedule. A large batch of US Treasuries matures in June, and if new buyers are not found, the crisis will deepen. Inevitably, the US will likely need to turn to China again. Recall that during the Biden administration, Treasury Secretary Yellen visited China multiple times to persuade Beijing to purchase more treasuries, to no avail. The Trump administration may face similar challenges. On May 15th, the US Treasury reported that foreign central banks reduced their Treasury holdings by $9.651 billion in the week ending May 8, indicating ongoing anonymous central bank selling in international futures markets. Massive selling has pushed long-term Treasury prices further down, with the 30-year yield hitting 4.98%, just shy of the psychologically critical 5% threshold, and the 10-year yield surpassing 4.5%. While US stocks remain strong amid Trump's rhetoric and market manipulation, this does not signal crisis resolution. In April, when Trump announced a tariff hike to 245% on Chinese goods, the 10-year Treasury yield was still in a safe zone at 4.01%. Just 1 month later, however, the market realized the US Treasury is engaged in a dangerous game of issuing debt with one hand and burning money with the other. With the $36.1 trillion debt ceiling rendered meaningless and $9.3 trillion in bonds maturing in 2025 hanging like a sword of Damocles. Adding to the surrealism, the US government is using unconventional accounting tricks to delay default while drafting a $5 trillion tax cut plan, a textbook case of a debt addict borrowing to fuel indulgence. When Trump announced reciprocal tariffs in April, he likely did not anticipate they would become the trigger for a Treasury market collapse. Latest US economic data reveals a 5-year record decline in April PPI, slowing retail sales, and a shrinking New York Fed manufacturing index, indicating rising manufacturing costs and shrinking scale due to tariff key factors in triggering stagflation. Falling homebuilder confidence further signals pessimism about the US real estate market, highlighting the deepening economic impact of tariffs. Wall Street is now betting on a recession, with expectations that the Federal Reserve will slash rates drastically this year. Thus, the stock market rally reflects not Trump's leadership, but market bets that economic deterioration will force the Fed into rate cuts and a new round of quantitative easing news that may not bode well for overseas central banks. On May 17th, the US Treasury released March Treasury holdings data. China sold $18.9 billion in treasuries that month, hitting a 14-year low. This reduction reshuffled the ranking of US foreign creditors, with the UK overtaking China at $779.3 billion in holdings, while Japan retained its top position with $1.13 trillion. As China reduces its holdings of US Treasury bonds, it is simultaneously increasing its gold reserves. The People's Bank of China has recently released updated gold holding data, showing that China added 70,000 ounces of gold during the same period, bringing the central bank's total gold reserves to 1,926 tons, valued at $87.3 billion. The rationale behind this is straightforward. While China may accept lending to the US short-term to earn investment returns, it is reluctant to tie up large sums of money in the US long-term. On one hand, China and the world at large has dimmed expectations for America's long-term economic prospects. On the other, the US is already buried under a mountain of debt, and given the US government's current tactics of seeking to take advantage at every turn, it is uncertain whether it will renege on its obligations in the future. Therefore, rather than purchasing large quantities of US Treasuries, China can opt for better investment alternatives. Moreover, a recent report by Deutsche Bank indicates that eurozone countries are shifting from US Treasuries to German bonds, as Berlin is seen as more reliable than Washington. Market data tells the story. The US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has plummeted from 70% to 57%, a 30-year low. In recent months, shorting US Treasuries has become one of Wall Street's most popular trades. Goldman Sachs has gone even further, raising its target yield for the 10-year Treasury to 5.2%. These former Treasury bulls have turned bearish after calculating that the US government spends $2.4 billion daily on interest payments, more than the Pentagon's daily military expenditure. At the gold trading market in Zurich, global central banks are accelerating their gold reserves, as though bracing for greater uncertainties despite the gradual de-escalation of two conflicts. While the White House preaches America first, the ratio of US Treasury debt to GDP has surpassed 132%. The Federal Reserve, while raising rates to combat inflation, has secretly printed money to bail out the US Treasury, increasing the supply of dollars in the market and contributing to the decline in the US dollar index. When the Bretton Woods system established the US dollar's hegemony in 1944, the US held 75% of the world's gold reserves. Today, as China holds 20,000 tons of gold and Russia dismantles dollarization at great cost, the Federal Reserve's gold vaults contain only 8,133 tons, and questions linger about how much of it is actually tangible. Consequently, many research reports suggest that 2025 will mark the beginning of the US Treasury collapse. Against this backdrop, Trump has turned his attention back to China. In a recent interview with Fox News, Trump stated that while China previously faced a 145% tariff, it was reduced to 30% after negotiations, with China lowering its tariffs to 10%. Trump emphasized that this de-escalation reflects not only the US's goodwill toward China, but also averts a new economic crisis. When asked by a Fox News reporter whether he would visit China, Trump replied affirmatively, stressing the importance of US-China relations. Notably, these remarks contrast sharply with his earlier tough stance toward China, when he threatened to further increase tariffs on China within 90 days if no agreement was reached, though not to the 145% level, but still a significant hike. Now, Trump's public about-face and expressed willingness to visit China signal, to some extent, that he needs China's help. Looking at the major challenges facing the US, the upcoming maturity of US Treasuries is perhaps the only problem that requires China's intervention to resolve, simply because the total amount of these bonds is so enormous that no other country besides China has the capacity to absorb them. However, this raises a new question. Trump's capricious nature has already been seen through by China. How can China be expected to help the US through this crisis? That's all for today's program. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means a lot to me. See you next time.